Hello, everyone. This is going to be chapter 20 from Business Culture to the Great Depression. We've already done the business culture part, most of it in class with in class presentations. So here we're going to move into the Harlem Renaissance. We're going to cover it here a bit, cover it more in class, and then get into the Great Depression as well, just the beginnings of it. So, like I said, a lot of this was started in class presentations. We are going to start, though, with a primary source, which is Langston Hughes's poem, Harlem, oftentimes just called A Dream Deferred, where he says, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode?" So let's first take a look at. We've been talking a little bit in class about how America was dealing with racial issues and a lot of racial discrimination and the rise of the KKK during this time. And we see also that this impacted immigrants as well. In this time period, we see newer and stricter anti immigration laws passing. This is partially due to the fact that they aren't as necessary anymore to keep restocking the workload. For instance, mechanization has gotten to the point now where immigration is not as important as it once was to sort of refill the ranks. We also see that African Americans had begun to become hired by white businesses and factories in the North following the Great Migration. So they are a viable workforce as well now. So we see that they start to crack down on the number of immigrants. And this, of course, also has to do just with sort of the feelings of keeping America pure that was around during this time, again, with the rise of the KKK. We saw the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924 that actually capped the number of incoming immigrants from 150,000 per year. It banned immigration from Asia, except from our colony of the Philippines. And in general, it started this sort of quota system that focused on getting people from the select number of places. The number of people who could come and immigrate to America was based on where they were. Not like equal numbers across the board, but like Africa was right out the door. Eastern Europe had a smaller number of people. Western Europe, interestingly enough, Germany had a large number of people, considering that we just fought them in a war. The fact that we're calling in more people from Germany than almost anywhere else is astonishing at this moment. The most illegal immigrants we had were actually from Eastern Europe trying to sneak in from Canada at that time. So here is Uncle Sam saying this is not a dumping ground, as Europe is trying to send us all of their trash and refuse and cast-offs. Now, many of America's leaders in the 1920s were highlighting the lack of equality um, as more of a fact, or even as basically that this is the way things are, not necessarily of a thing that we need to fix. For instance, Warren G. Harding said that equality should be eliminated from consideration. It's not an issue, according to Harding. And Coolidge commented that America should be kept for Americans, by which he meant white, generally Anglo-Saxon Americans. But the quotas that we see being passed deeply favored the European majority at that time, and Western Europe more than any other group in Europe. Now, this nation was also split in very interesting ways about the idea of cultural pluralism, whether or not we should have a nation of many diverse, unique cultures, or a nation of one sort of homogeneous, across the board culture instead. And so many large cities had ethnic enclaves, and some people said that's a good thing. They're adding their own unique spin on America. Other people said no, they should really figure out how to sort of assimilate into American culture. One thing that actually helped with this was mass culture. The fact that every movie house was showing the same movies and everybody was listening to the same music meant that people were almost by force of culture being asked to be part of the English speaking American culture. Now, some immigrant women did also look at American culture and say that's better than the way we're being treated in, in Russia, so maybe we should sort of adapt to the more freewheeling female empowerment version of things going on right now. Now, these groups of immigrants were pushing for an increase also in American tolerance, though. We do see that whether or not they wanted to assimilate, they definitely wanted to be accepted. So we see, for instance, a rising sort of push against anti Semitism by the Anti Defamation League. Also, many nativist and anti foreign language laws were overturned by immigrant groups during this time. Groups are marching in protest against the KKK. So it wasn't like the KKK were just doing stuff and everybody was like, well, I guess we have to let them do their thing. There were absolutely people who were more interested in putting a stop to them as well. So, in one last group, and we're going to look at this way more in class, is the emergence of Harlem as sort of the 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 focal point, the central nervous point of a black resurgence during this time period. The Great Migration had sort of brought people to this area, an influx of African Americans in many big cities, but the one of the major points is in Harlem. It is thought to be sort of the capital of Black America during the 20s. And before we get to life in Harlem, it was also popular for whites too. Um, uh, White people would sort of go in. The book called it slumming. They would basically go into this area that wasn't considered theirs at the time and sort of go in and watch a show at the Cotton Club, which was all black performers, all black entertainers. Most Harlem businesses were white owned as well, at least at that time in that era. So here, for instance, is a promotion for the Cotton Club with Bill Robinson, better known by some as Bojangles. He was the famous dancer who I know him a lot from the Shirley Temple dance movies that he did, and also Cab Calloway, one of the greatest band leaders of that time period. But this is a promotion for the Cotton Club. We also see Harlem was probably most famous as sort of the center of black culture. We see musicians, we see singers, we see dancers, also poets, writers, artists, playwrights, political activists. We've already talked about Marcus Garvey, and we'll go much deeper into this aspect of the Harlem Renaissance in class. I want to go much deeper into this in class. But this time period, this Harlem Renaissance, focused on what is referred to as the New Negro, which is a time where Black Americans felt that they were more free to express themselves, to be their own person, to advocate for their own interests, and to protest injustice than they had at any other time in American history. And often these artists and poets sort of had a focal interest in Africa as their starting point, as their inspiration. This is sort of inspired by Marcus Garvey's Pan-Africanist movement. But it also focused on rural Southern traditions of storytelling as well. So a lot of African Americans who had lived most of their life in the South wrote books like Zora Neale Hurston talking about their eyes were watching God is a good example, where people talk as if, they're from the Deep South. Now, Harlem is the epicenter of this movement, but they're not the only epicenter. So basically, in all these other big cities with large black populations, there is sort of a section of town oftentimes that is considered almost the African American section of town. Now, a lot of them did move to Harlem as well during this time period, though. So that's what's going on with culture. We're wrapping up culture. We're moving into the Great Depression. The election of 1928, Herbert Hoover gets into the White House. It is a blowout. It is a huge victory for Hoover. And it seemed like, the ball's rolling uphill from here on in. Hoover had risen from poverty to become a very successful mining engineer. He had lived around the world. He had become famous for being sort of the leader of the group that was feeding Europe during World War I. And then he became Secretary of Commerce, so he is doing very well. And he focused on building up big businesses, promoting privately funded aid instead of government aid, and condemning government regulation. He did not like government regulation in business. And this all looked great for Hoover. He even in 1928, the gods, boy, they sure do love hubris, don't they? He said, "Poverty will soon be banished from the earth." That's calling your shot just a little bit early. And this positive economic outlook allowed Herbert Hoover to win big in 1928. He beat Al Smith, who is most noteworthy probably for being he was a Tammany Hall, New York politician, but he was also the first major Catholic nominee for president in the United States. In the end, Hoover won 444 to 87, and he even got a lot of the Democratic South to vote for him, too. So, yeah, balls rolling uphill. What could possibly go wrong? Well, of course, what did go wrong? Well, first we have Herbert Hoover. He is our president from 1929 to 1933. Gosh, why is he only a one-term president? What could have happened that made people not like Hoover? He is originally from Iowa, although, like I said, he bumped all over the world. He is the former Secretary of Commerce, and he never held an elected position before being president. President was the first thing he was elected to, and the last thing he was elected to as well. And he also spoke fluent Mandarin. Like I said, he was a mining engineer. He moved all over the world, and he and his wife could speak Mandarin to each other, even years afterwards. So, what happened? Most people point to Black Tuesday as the beginning of the Great Depression, the day the stock market fell. It definitely didn't help, that's for sure, but the stock market crash lost $10 billion of money, and that's back then. The Depression had been building up, though, for a little while, and some people had been sort of warning about it, although they were mainly just sort of brushed off. The 1920s had seen a lot of speculation, which is basically gambling in the stock market. You're hoping that, like, I'm going to put I want $100 worth of stock, so I'm going to put in $10 now, and I'm going to hope that the stock keeps rising, and as long as the stock market keeps going up, I'll pay back the other 90 and make a little extra off the top as well. It's a dangerous gamble to do this, and so people were hoping that their stocks would pay off later. They didn't always. So, for instance, here is the Wall Street panic. This is right at the beginning of the Great Depression right here. October 24th, this is actually a couple days before Black Tuesday. Now, along with rampant speculation, America was coming down off of the post-World War I buying spree that everybody had been on. American sales of cars and manufacturing had been falling for years. Europe was also demanding less American goods, partially because their countries were now rebuilt. They didn't need to depend on American goods as much anymore. And there were also lots of strong tariffs, taxes on foreign goods, stopping other countries from trading with each other. And this led to a large decline in world markets, and it hit not the Great Depression we generally think of as an American issue, but it really hit around the world and had a massive impact all over the world. Now, during the Depression, the price of stocks went down huge. And this is horrible for Americans, many of whom, even regular Americans, not real stockbrokers or anything, but just everyday Joes, had put all of their money into the stock market. We also see the price of foods went way down, which could be good, but also basically people couldn't afford that food anyway, so it was still too high a price for these people to buy. A positive, not a positive estimate, but like an estimate that was hopeful and speculative that this is, as bad as it went, said that a fourth of the nation was out of work. Some people think it may have been as high as a third, but people were way out of work during this time. So here's a famous picture of a stockbroker who lost it all and now is trying to sell his car for $100 straight up cash. Now, the Depression had an impact on all Americans. This was not just people who put their money in stocks. This was people all over America. Many Americans set off for better work. We've seen, or if you are reading that book in English Lit, if you've read The Grapes of Wrath, it's the story of a group of Midwestern farmers from Oklahoma who leave for California looking for jobs and work. Now, many of these farmers left the Dust Bowl Midwest and started looking for other places, but we do see that other groups are moving to the farms out of the cities. This is the first time that we see city populations decline, actually. Big cities are also setting up food networks, bread lines, soup kitchens, mainly done by private companies and charities at this point, not done by the US government in order to help feed the unemployed. We also see that with a lack of housing and people being evicted, people are setting up shop wherever they can. And this leads to a lot of people creating shanty towns out of cardboard and tin and whatever else they can find that sheltered the homeless in big cities, usually in public parks and other areas like this. These places were called Hoovervilles as a thank you to Mr. Hoover. So here's a Chicago breadline. And here is a man sitting in the St. Louis Hooverville in 1931. The St. Louis riverfront had one of the biggest in the country, containing over 3 to 5,000 people. They had a church, they had a mayor, they had schools and things like that set up. So St. Louis actually had one of the bigger Hoovervilles in the world, in the country. Here's another one in Seattle that gives you a wider view of it. Now, this depression, you have to remember, it's called a depression. That should give you a bit of an indication that it's not just economic, but it's mental too. The suicide rate rose during this time, and the birth rate was falling. Along with this, a lot of people had sort of their hopes for American democracy and American capitalism shaken by what happened during this time. Many thought that, we weren't going to come back from this. Businesses who went out of business basically showed that they had been running scams for years, and shell games and Ponzi schemes, and so a lot of the corruption behind the veneer was shown, a lot of the Gilded Age kind of stuff. Now, many Americans reacted to this depression with almost self-disgust. It's weird. They blamed themselves for the depression, not anyone else. They thought it was their fault. Others, however, were a bit more angry and protested, usually rather unorganized protests to begin with, as unions had become largely unpopular, so unions who would have probably run these protests didn't have the power anymore. In 1932, over 20,000 unemployed veterans from the First World War went looking for bonuses that they'd been promised after the war. And in response, the army was called out and basically kicked these guys out of town, this bonus army. All of this looked very bad, sort of these young soldiers kicking out these sort of down and out ex-veterans of the First World War. It was a bad look. So here are the bonus army veterans heading to Washington, and here's what they got when they got there. So these are U.S. Army and U.S. police kicking these veterans out of their Hooverville. Now, the most organized protest probably came from the Communist Party. Some Americans had even applied to move to the USSR during the Depression. This group was protesting the eviction of the unemployed. They were organizing marches. They were calling for the government to give public assistance, which Hoover refused to do. Some groups even worried that this was the end of capitalism and worried that, this is going to turn us into anarchy or turn us into communists here. Now, Hoover received a lot of advice from his cabinet that this was normal, that this could even be a good thing. It's sort of like, depressions are a natural response to an oversaturation of the market. Depressions can also drop the price of goods, get rid of bad businesses and things like that. However, people weren't really buying this. So Hoover didn't really offer any sort of federal assistance, at least at first he didn't. He called for private charities and big businesses to offer support, but he believed that the U.S. government should stay out of the aid business. And he called this associational action, and he believed that this was the way to go. However, many people who saw this thought he just doesn't care, or he's way out of touch. And so here's a political cartoon where Hoover is saying, yes, I can indeed sympathize with anyone who's about to lose his home, because he's about to lose his home, which is the White House. Now, when Hoover finally did sort of lurch into action, it didn't work very well, partially because people still felt that he wasn't really helping out the regular people. So, for instance, we see the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 that raised tariffs higher than they'd ever been. The hope was that it would raise the price of American goods overseas, and that foreign countries would buy American goods, and the money would get back to America. Unfortunately, the downside of all of this is we raised our tariffs, therefore other people raised their tariffs, and suddenly no countries are trading with anybody in this situation. And so by 1932, Hoover had created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is almost the beginning of a. We're going to see with Franklin Roosevelt a lot of what's called the New Deal. This is sort of Hoover's first steps toward a possible New Deal. He gave money to the banks and the big businesses, hoping that the money would trickle down to the workers. It didn't, though, because if you imagine you're giving a loan to a business that's running short on money, the last thing it's going to do is to give it away. It's going to hold on tight to that money instead. He also was still opposing direct relief for people at a personal level, so he was not offering this still. And we'll take a look more at the Great Depression and the New Deal in Chapter 21.